you're with us here. Glad you're here. We're going to have a lovely evening conversation, Saturday night chat. Glad to be here with all of you. Glad you all are here. Now, folks, I always am totally real with all of you. I'm totally real with all of you. Totally upfront, totally clear about things. So tonight, I'm going to inform you of a very, very important change that is taking place tonight. It's my responsibility to tell you what it is. Tonight, this very night, will be the first live in which I am drinking unnamed Mexican fruit punch beverage rather than unnamed diet beverage or unnamed orange beverage. So it is unnamed Mexican fruit punch beverage. So we want to be absolutely clear on that, right? I mean, I know that the beverage that I drink on these lives is a very, very, very important aspect of what we do here. Most of the time it is unnamed diet beverage, so I'm pumped full of caffeine to talk to you. If we're late at night, usually it's unnamed orange beverage because I want to be able to sleep the next day. However, tonight we're doing something we haven't done before. We have not entered this territory yet as a community. We have not yet explored unnamed Mexican fruit punch beverage. Now, you may ask, why do we always say unnamed, right? Why don't we just say the brand? That is because of the fact that I have not yet received a royalty check from the company that bottles the soda, the company that bottles the orange juice, or the company that bottles the orange or bottles the fruit punch. So until I receive a royalty check, I will not do advertising for them. It is unnamed diet beverage, unnamed orange beverage, unnamed fruit punch, Mexican fruit punch. It is that until the time in which I can enter a cooperative understanding with the corporations that make these beverages, at which point I will then do my duty and name drop them. But until then, it remains an unnamed beverage. That is how it works here. I'm glad you all understand this. Glad I could just be level with everyone. Just be absolutely level with everyone. So as I drink the unnamed fruit punch, do not panic. If it doesn't go well, we'll switch back to unnamed orange beverage or unnamed diet beverage. But for tonight, we're going to experiment with something new, right? I believe Star Trek, right? The opening lines of the TV show Star Trek had something about to boldly go where no man has gone before. Well, we are boldly going to where no live has gone before, and it's a lot of fun. So welcome. Glad you're all here. Glad you all are here. Look, we've got a lot of things to talk about tonight. You all know the normal formula. I give my opening remarks, which I often intend to be short and end up being long, or I intend to be long and end up being short. And I'm not a very good measurer of how long the opening remarks are, but I give the opening remarks. And as I'm giving my opening remarks, you all send me your super chats. Your super chats come in. I write them down. Then we do our roll call, and I call you all out as I see you. All right. Lula, that's the first super chat from I.O. Hillary, good friend of the community here. Lula de Silva. And then from there, after I do the roll call, then I answer your super chat questions. And after I answer your super chat questions, then I am done. And that's the end of the stream. That's how we do it here. That is the format. So if you have something you want me to discuss in the second half of the show, it is your responsibility to send me a super chat so that I make a point of discussing it, at which point you will make that super chat, and I will then write it down and answer it. You send me a super chat, I will send you an answer. It may not be the answer that you want. Do we ever get the answer that we want in life? Does anyone ever give you exactly the answer that you want? That's a good question. But anyhow, that's how we roll. So opening remarks, roll call, super chats, and we're done. That's how it works. So strap in for the ride. It's like a roller coaster on here sometimes. Strap in for the ride. Take a deep breath. Stretch. Reflect on all the fun things you did today. Reflect on how much you love your friends and family. Take some deep breaths, and let's get going. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. And let's go. Folks, New York City can't make up its mind about whether it's going to full-on be spring, summerish, or whether it's going to remain cold, right? It was pretty chilly today. I will say my allergies cleared up. I have not been able to breathe through my nose more than today this week. This was the most I've been able to breathe through my nose in the past 7 days. So at least the allergies were clearing up, but it's still on the fence about becoming spring, summerish. It's still going back and forth, even though it is April. And the situation in the country certainly leaves plenty to be desired. If we look out, we've got an epidemic of brutal police brutality. The latest situation with this young man just killed by the police. We've got the Derek Chauvin trial of the police who killed George Floyd ongoing. Meanwhile, we've got anger in the country about economic fallout. We've got infrastructure falling apart. We've got Marjorie Taylor Greene in the House of Representatives talking about forming an America First caucus that would be about defending Anglo-Saxon values. Anglo-Saxon, really, that's right. We're going to have Ivanhoe values. Ivanhoe, right? You ever read Ivanhoe? That's when I first heard the term Anglo-Saxon. When I was a child, I learned about the book Ivanhoe. And, Sir Walter Scott and Normans and Saxons fighting each other, and Robin Hood makes an epic appearance. I really don't think that's what she meant. And the choice of the word Anglo-Saxon has got a lot of people raising their eyebrows, and that's where the country is headed. Further polarization. Didn't cost Trotsky from taking Warsaw. So, yes, we are facing further polarization, a rising police state, etc. This is going to be quite a summer, I think. There's going to be lots of unrest on the horizon, and that raises the question, which has been kind of an ongoing theme in these conversations: is unrest in and of itself a good thing? Is chaos in the streets in and of itself progressive? For years, that was the position that I took as a communist, as an activist. I took the position that we've got to get in the streets after the 2008 financial meltdown, when Barack Obama took into office. That was the mantra of the political group I was part of. Get in the streets. We built something called the Bail Out the People movement, BOPM. We organized a march on Wall Street, and Michael Moore promoted it on his website. And we worked very, very hard to get people in the streets, get people protesting. It's time to get in the streets. That was our mantra, and we beat that drum very loudly. Get in the streets, protest, street heat. Get in the streets, protest. That was our mantra. And, we organized a lot of protests and rallies. We reserved a lot of permits. We set up a lot of sound systems. We yelled into many microphones. And then other forces who were much better funded and much better connected started doing roughly the same thing. I remember it'll be 10 years since Occupy Wall Street. And that was not called by the leftist forces. It wasn't one of the small little communist parties. It was Adbusters. George W. Bush years. Adbusters. This hipster magazine that that called for Occupy Wall Street. Thoughts on Malthusianism in the old left. Right. Malthusianism in the old left. And furthermore, Occupy Wall Street took off. Big protests in New York City, Occupy encampments set up around the country, lots of big protests, lots of people in the streets. Then, you'll recall that after that, you had the killing of Trayvon Martin. I don't know if folks remember Trayvon Martin. He was a African-American young man who was visiting his girlfriend in a gated community. He was walking down the street, and a guy named George Zimmerman, who had taken it upon himself to be a community patrol or community watch guy, stalked him, called the police. The police told him the guy's just walking down the street. He's not doing anything wrong. There was some kind of altercation, and this self-appointed community watch guy killed Trayvon Martin. And because this guy who killed Trayvon Martin was, half white, half Latino, and the son of a judge, he got acquitted for a case that looked like a pretty blatant case of murder, right? If you follow someone who's just minding their own business, and you follow them down the street, and you call the police, and the police tell you to leave the person alone, he's not doing anything wrong, and you still follow them, and then you get out, and there's a fight, and then you kill them, generally, that looks like a case of murder. But George Zimmerman was acquitted. He was acquitted, and there was outrage throughout the country. Outrage around the country, and that's where the hashtag Black Lives Matter came from. It was a hashtag, BLM, and the slogan Black Lives Matter came out of that. Shortly after that, in Ferguson, Missouri, there was an uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, against police brutality after the police killed someone, and after the ongoing situation in the town where there was just the constant harassment of the community. You could barely walk 2 feet without getting a ticket, and the community had just had it, and every night there would be fighting in the streets for night after night after night, and all kinds of high-tech weapons and riot gear was used, and it was like an armed standoff in the town of Ferguson, Missouri. I went out to Ferguson, Missouri. I even made a little documentary, about a half-hour documentary, about the situation in Ferguson, interviewing people on the streets of Ferguson, Missouri. And after Ferguson, it was Baltimore. The streets of Baltimore went up in flames in the aftermath of a police killing. And the struggle continues. People are in the streets. People are definitely in the streets. People are in the streets, right? And this summer, it was George Floyd and his killing. People are in the streets. They were in the streets for Stop Donald Trump protests. They're in the streets about Black Lives Matter. They are in the streets and Antifa and marching against. I don't know about that. You gave me 3 names there. 3 names. So. And people are in the streets. People are definitely in the streets. But is people being in the streets in and of itself going to really change things? No. No, it's not. I'm just being blatantly clear with you. I'm just being very level with you, just like I was about the unnamed Mexican fruit punch. Right? Just people being in the streets is not going to really change things. Right? People are angry. People see the hashtag, and they go out into the streets. And they protest. wrote it down. Go out in the streets and they protest. But what really changes? What really changes? I mean, at the end of the day, not much really changes. Not much really changes. And in fact, what's particularly interesting is that the protests that are currently being called, while they're generated by social media, and it is generally social media that makes these protests happen, social media announces the locations of the protests. People hear about them because they get notifications on Twitter and Facebook, etc. While social media generates these protests, they generally come in the form of just kind of people spontaneously assembling because they heard about it on social media. Used to be that part of the role that the organized left played, groups like the Socialist Workers' Party or the Workers' World Party, the role that these groups played was that they would facilitate these protests. You know, during the Vietnam War, there were massive demonstrations against the Vietnam War in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of thousands of people would march against the Vietnam War. And during the Vietnam War, it was the Socialist Workers' Party, the Trotskyites. They were the group that was probably the most key in organizing national big anti-war rallies in Washington, D.C. They had a group called the National Mobilization to stop the war in Vietnam. PLA, invasion, tank, Taiwan, economy. And they would build these demonstrations, these massive protests. From what I understand, during the Vietnam War, when there were protests going on during the Vietnam War, there were 3 sections of the movement. You could call the movement, right? The anti-Vietnam War movement, the left movement in the United States, had 3 sections. And this is generally what happens during an upsurge, right? When leftist politics and Marxism and socialism become popular, you generally get 3 poles. You get the moderates, you get the center, and you get the left. That's generally how it works. You get the moderates, you get the center, and then you get the left. During the Russian Revolution, for example, the Bolsheviks were the left. The left Mensheviks and the left socialist revolutionaries were the center, and the Menshevik party was the right, was the moderates. Well, in the United States during the Vietnam War era, the moderates were the Communist Party. The Communist Party of the United States, because it was very, very much believed that the Democratic Party, it was important for the Democrats to get elected. It was important for the world that the Republicans, who they deemed to be fascists, be kept out of office. The Communist Party of the United States, they focused on having demonstrations against the Vietnam War, and they often had demonstrations that did not call for the war to actually end. They had demonstrations called "Negotiate Now." That was the slogan the Communist Party used during the war. They said, "Negotiate now." And the idea was that there may be people in the Democratic Party who didn't want to end the war, but they would go to these rallies because they wanted to negotiate. And they could get pastors, and they could get Catholic priests, and they could get members of Congress to speak. And the Communist Party, they would have peace parades, they were called. They would have a banner that said "Negotiate Now," and they would have members of Congress, and they'd have prominent, Roman Catholic clergy and prominent pastors and ministers and rabbis, and they would do this. In New York City, the peace parades were very famous. They were also big on nuclear disarmament, ban the bomb. And so they would have ban the bomb marches against the hydrogen bomb or against an escalation of the arms race. They would have peace parades, they were called, where the slogan was "Negotiate Now." And that's what they did. And those rallies tended to be quite big, but they weren't 100% against the war. They were for negotiation. They were in favor of peace, but they weren't calling for an immediate end to the war. And that was what the Communist Party did. They were the moderates during the Vietnam War protest era. Then you had the Trotskyites, the Socialist Workers' Party, the SWP. The SWP, they had the National Mobilization to End the Vietnam War. And they were for peaceful, legal, single-issue protests. And they would have big demonstrations, end the war in Vietnam, bring the troops home. And they would have big demonstrations, and they were big on the fact that they did not believe in anything illegal. No civil disobedience, no street fighting, no vandalism, none of that. And they had these marshals that would march up and down the parade route. And these marshals were known. If you were doing anything radical, they would kick you out of the march, right? If you had a sign supporting the Black Panthers, they would kick you out of the march. If you waved the flag of the Vietnamese National Liberation Front, or you were, you had a sign calling for communist revolution, they would rip that flag out of your hands, right? If you had a sign supporting the Black Panthers, they would rip it out of your hands. This is a single issue march, they would say, with their marshal squads. And they said this is a single issue march, end the war in Vietnam, peaceful, meaning no street fighting, no confrontation, legal, meaning, no law breaking, no civil disobedience, and single issue, meaning you're not allowed to bring any other slogan to the march. The SWP had probably the biggest demonstrations against the Vietnam War. With these peaceful, legal, single issue rallies, they would get hundreds of thousands of people in Washington, D.C., and that was the SWP. Now, then you had what was called the left, and, the left current. And that was the Weather Underground, what eventually became the Weathermen, the Students for a Democratic Society current. That was Maoists, that was the Black Panther Party, that was Youth Against War and Fascism, or YOF, which was the youth wing of the Workers' World Party, which people referred to as Maoist Trotskyites, and they would go to the big demonstrations called by the Communist Party or called by the SWP, and they would form what they called breakaway marches. And, they would often have fights with the marshals, right? They would come to the rallies. The Workers' World Party, they were famous. They had the slogan. They wanted to link the anti-war struggle with the support for the Black Panthers. So they would raise the slogan, "Stop the war against Black America." And of course, because that was not a single issue, the SWP marshals would try to take their banners away. The Students for a Democratic Society, the Progressive Labor Party, the Weathermen, they were famous for bringing the flags of the Vietnamese National Liberation Front to their rally. Okay. Capital. They would bring the flags of the National Liberation Front of Vietnam to the demonstrations. They would chant, "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is gonna win. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is gonna win." Right, one side's right, one side's wrong, victory to the Viet Cong. And they would wave the National Liberation Front. And that was like a very provocative thing to do. I mean, they were waving the flag of the enemy. And they would do that. And of course, these SWP marshals would try to take their flags away. And basically what would happen is, even though they would assemble at the same demonstration, that the SWP or the CPUSA had called, the left current would break away and basically have their own march without a permit, right? There would be no permit for their march, and they would break away and have a breakaway march. Because the marshals that often tried to take the flags or the signs supporting the Black Panthers away from the left, because those marshals were in the Socialist Workers' Party. From what I understand, the Weathermen or the Students for a Democratic Society or Black Panther aligned marchers would actually chant at the marshals. They would chant against Trotskyism as they were fighting with the marshals. The SWP would have its team of marshals that would try to take their flags away or try to force them to stay on the sidewalk and not get into the street, etc. And from what I understand, the version of events I was recounted to me, sometimes the Progressive Labor Party or the Weathermen or the Black Panthers, they would begin chanting things like "Every chicken needs a pot, every ice pick needs a trot," or they would chant things to the effect of "Joe Stalin, he's no fool, he killed Trotsky, that was cool." And they would refer to the marshals who were confiscating these people's, and trying to keep the march peaceful, legal, and single issue. They would refer to them as trots, and trot became a slur at these demonstrations. And that was where a lot of this fighting got going. Now, that was the three currents during the anti-Vietnam War protest movement. But basically, it was just three major groups that were organizing protests, right? if people were going to protest the Vietnam War, somebody had to set up the permit, somebody had to set up the stage, and so within the people organizing protests, you had three major groupings. You had the Communist Party with their Negotiate Now peace parades, you had the SWP with their national mobilization to end the Vietnam War, peaceful, legal, single issue, and then you had the left, which were the street fighters who waved the Viet Cong flag and supported the Black Panthers, etc. And that was generally how stuff went down. What's interesting is now it's completely different. Now, yeah, sure, the Answer Coalition might get a permit and a stage and try to do their thing, but at the end of the day, the biggest protests that we are seeing, Black Lives Matter, Occupy, Stop Trump, the biggest protests that we're seeing are not called by any leftist group. They are simply announced on social media, right? The hashtags go out, and whoever is manipulating the algorithms calls on people to get into the streets. The memo goes out, and a crowd of people come, and they don't have a permit, and they don't have a stage, and they don't have anyone really directing them. It's like crowds kind of form, based on social media manipulation. It's spontaneous, but it's not exactly spontaneous. There are forces that are able to manipulate it, but it's a different ball game. It's a very, very different ball game. A very, 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 very different ball game, right, than in the 1960s, where these individual communist groups would do it. Now, all of these communist groups were infiltrated by the FBI. The Communist Party was infiltrated by the FBI. The SWP was infiltrated by the FBI. The Weathermen and the I shouldn't call them ultra-left, but the left current, they were all infiltrated by the FBI. And the government was tapping all their phones and listening to what all they were doing. But at the same time, they were independently, they had their own organizations, and they were building these demonstrations. The nature of U.S. imperialism changed in the last 25 years. Will U.S. use Afghanistan to antagonize China? Nature. Use. It's a long question. Anyway, so that was how these things were done. But at the same time, there were real organizations that were doing these demonstrations, right? I mean, the Communist Party, a lot of very dedicated people who were not FBI agents, who were just members of the Communist Party, worked to make the peace parades happen. A lot of people were very dedicated, members of the SWP, not FBI agents, just SWP folks. They organized these protests against the Vietnam War in D.C. A lot of people who really truly believed in the position of the Progressive Labor Party or the Weathermen or the Workers' World Party or Youth Against War and Fascism, they built these breakaway marches and these contingents. That's how things were done. That is not how things are done currently. The current movement out in the streets is much more, it is on the one hand much more centrally controlled, right? It is much more centrally controlled. On the other hand, it is much less controlled. It's much more spontaneous, right? That on the one hand, look, if I, Caleb, were to just call a protest, and maybe all of you might come, it would have nowhere near the support. But if whoever is the controller of the hashtag decides, hey, in New York City or Philadelphia or Chicago, we're going to have a Black Lives Matter protest tonight, and they make it go viral, it happens. The forces that have the wealth and the money and the influence in Silicon Valley have far more influence over the protest movement currently. But on the other hand, when those people get there, right, when the thousands of people that see on Twitter that tonight there's a protest, when they get there, what they do is far less controlled. There's not marshals there saying, stay on the sidewalk, go. No, there's not a stage set up. There's not, it is much more spontaneous. It is much more, hey, you're there, you got the hashtag, you show up. And yes, there is brutal repression, and these people get shot with rubber bullets, and these people get hit with tear gas, and these people get brutally beaten up and arrested, and, that is the situation. But we are in a new ball game. We're in a new ball game, right? People in the United States are protesting all the time. Protests in the United States they grow on trees practically. There is a protest every time you turn around. And CNN is practically encouraging people to go out and protest. And, and there is a feeling among a lot of the population that these protests are justified. So that leads me back to the original point, which is protesting going to save us from the current situation? And the answer is no. No. I mean, no, I was wrong. Look, I didn't, I'll tell you something. Let me just go off on a tangent here, right? Excellent tweet regarding Reagan and drugs. Well, thank you, old gringo. Thank you. But, protesting is a normal, healthy thing to do, right? People in the United States have been protesting for years for all kinds of different reasons, right? I mean, and yet, when I was in college, when I was in high school, the people I went to school with, the people that I knew, all had in their minds this idea that only crazy, deranged people protest. And it was very, very bizarre. But, I knew many people who were against the war in Iraq, and I would say, oh, there's going to be a protest this weekend, and hand them a leaflet. And they'd say, oh, no, I can't go to that. I'm not a protester. I'd be like, what do you mean you're not a protester? And people would say things like, protesting has never accomplished anything. And I would say to them, Dr. Martin Luther King, what did he do? Dr. Martin Luther King, who we have a holiday about, got the Civil Rights Act. What did he do? Now, he protested. That was generally recognized that yes, protesting is something that people do. But there was just this weird double think that people had. It was like they had been brainwashed. It's like, no, protesters are dangerous. Protesters are criminal. Protesters are insane. A lot of people believe it is illegal to protest. They believe if you protest, you immediately get arrested because they heard protesters arrested on TV, so it's illegal. So if you go to a protest, you're going to get arrested. You just I think people think that the protests are just like people show up and then they just get arrested. It's not like that. But a lot of people, that used to be deeply embedded in a lot of middle America, was this idea that only deranged, crazy people protest. And when they do it, they're immediately arrested for doing it. The other trope I heard, and I've ranted against this before, is I was told over and over again that we should never protest a war ever again because during the Vietnam War, all these hippies went around spitting on soldiers, and they went around spitting on soldiers and calling them baby killers, and it was so awful, so therefore no one should ever protest a war again. However, if you talk to any anti-war GIs, they will tell you the opposite. No, the protesters did not spit on them and call them baby killers. The protest movement and the anti-war movement recruited the soldiers. And there was a huge anti-war movement within the U.S. military itself. And, this idea that hippies were going around spitting on the troops, that's not what actually happened. What happened was that the soldiers were joining the protests, and within the military, you had the rise of the Vietnam veterans against the war. You had the rise of the American servicemen. So that's not what happened. But there is this memo that's been sent out. But now things have significantly changed over the past 10, 20 years. Right now, among middle America, with CNN, with social media, people are not in that mode where they think, oh my God, anyone who ever protests is crazy. They don't think that. They don't think, oh my God, anyone who ever protests is a dangerous, deranged criminal. They don't think that anymore. They don't think protesting is automatically unpatriotic and disrespectful of the country. They don't think that anymore. So there is this culture in the United States where people do protest. And it's not just on the left. I mean, it's on the right, too. The Tea Party, the protests against Barack Obama, called by the Tea Party, that was certainly happening. We see, alt-right demonstrations that take place, that various right-wing patriot prayer and, gun rallies, and there was that big Trump, QAnon, protest that happened, on January 6th that we all know about. And so protesting is happening all across the United States, but things aren't getting better. Things are not getting better. In fact, I would say the political situation in the country is getting worse and worse and worse every day. I would argue that basically, at this point, there are two toxic ideologies that are prevailing in the United States. One of them is an ideology that is very popular in right-wing circles, and the other is an ideology that is very popular in left-wing circles. And until these ideologies are defeated, things in the United States will not improve. And it's not until people start protesting. No. It's until there is an ideological victory over these two belief systems, until there is a thorough refutation of these two deeply embedded ideas among the population, things will not improve. There are two concepts, one that is popular among the right and one that is popular among the left. And these two concepts must be repudiated. And they have to be repudiated intellectually. We have to change how people think, and that requires building an educational organization. I do not lead protests. I'm not involved in protests at this time. I'm not building any demonstration in the streets. I'm not doing that. I'm not even building a party. I'm not a member of any political party. My job, I believe, is to promote socialist education. I want to change the minds of people. I want to win people to a constructive socialism for the 21st century. And in order to do that, we have to go up against two big lies, two big toxic ideological poisons. The toxic ideological poison on the right is called libertarianism. And if you go to any Donald Trump demonstration, if you meet any people that are supporters of Donald Trump, if you meet anyone who is on the right, you will inevitably encounter libertarianism, right? And don't tell me that they're all fascists and all of that. I mean, they may have such views, but at the end of the day, the prevailing ideology in all right-wing circles is libertarianism. It is the belief that the individual comes above all else, that the government should have no role in the economy, that we don't have real capitalism in the United States because we have a post office and because there's an income tax. And what we need in the United States is real capitalism, which means getting rid of every social program. That is the prevailing viewpoint in Trump circles. You can disagree with me all you want, and there are many things about the Trump movement that are not libertarian. But among base Trumpers, anarcho-capitalism, libertarianism is the prevailing viewpoint. They think the United States government is communist. They think that because we have paved roads and because we have food stamps, we are a communist country. We need to restore real capitalism. They love Atlas Shrugged. They love Ayn Rand. They love Murray Rothbard. They love Ludwig von Mises and the Austrian school. Writing it down. They love that stuff. And that is what they believe. They believe in the individual above all else. They believe capitalism is utopia. They believe that selfishness is a virtue, that compassion is a form of weakness. Right. Okay, I hear you. Protest. Painful for capitalists. All right. Writing it down. That's what they believe. Right? That is the prevailing belief. The belief is that capitalism is sacred. We have too many social programs. The USA is already a communist socialist country. We need real capitalism back, private property above all else. That's what libertarian, that is the prevailing view. Writing it down. That is the prevailing view. Libertarian to fascist pipeline. That is the prevailing view on the right. And it's toxic. It's toxic because the United States is the most libertarian Western country that exists. The United States, unlike every other Western country, the United States does not have health care for the population. Not single payer, not national health care. We don't provide health care for people. We don't have anywhere near the social welfare state Western countries do. Right now, our infrastructure is falling apart. Municipalities are bankrupt and don't have enough, money to maintain paved roads at various parts of the country. Our unions are weaker than ever. The labor movement is weak. Labor protections are weak. We have a free market system. We have schools for profit. We have prisons for profit. The United States should be a libertarian paradise. There is no other Western country that is anywhere near as libertarian as the United States is at this time. Prisons for profit, schools for profit, unpaved roads because the government's bankrupt and can't afford to pay for it. We should be a paradise right now if libertarianism worked, right? If rolling back the role of government in society, privatizing everything. If that worked, the United States should be the most prosperous country in the Western world. Obviously, it's the opposite. So that's libertarianism. It is austerity economics. Cut the jobs of government workers, cut social programs, cut spending on the population, and somehow it will create growth, right? And 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? But if you have 4 and you take 2 away, you generally have 2, which is less than 4, right? Subtraction generally results in a lower total amount. Now, libertarians don't believe that. Libertarians don't believe in basic mathematics. Libertarians believe you can subtract your way into economic growth. That somehow, if we cut the jobs of government workers and all these people who are getting government wages, and if we cut the jobs of teachers that are getting decent pay and replace them with charter schools where the teachers make far less money and don't have collective bargaining power, if we cut food stamps, so people, low-income families can't afford to buy as much food, if we cut spending and we have crumbling roads, if we cut, magically growth comes out of it. That's what they believe, that magically you can cut your way into growth. If you start reducing the amount of government spending, somehow growth magically comes out of it. That's what they believe. And it has never worked anywhere. Didn't work in Chile under Pinochet. There wasn't the Chilean economic miracle happened a decade later when they abandoned libertarian economics, right? Didn't work in the Eastern Bloc, the mass privatizations and shock therapy economics that followed the fall of the Soviet and wrecked the place. Libertarianism in Russia in the 90s was a nightmare. Libertarianism across the Eastern Bloc was a nightmare. Didn't work in Bolivia where they privatized the water. It's never worked anywhere. It leads to mass impoverishment, mass death and suffering. But libertarians believe it because it is their religion. It is their religion. They are dedicated to the belief that compassion is weakness, that caring for another person is a flaw in the human species, that we should all be selfish, indifferent to other people, that we should, that the might is right, that human solidarity and altruism is something that should be eradicated. That's libertarianism. And it's nuts, and it's evil, and it's destroying the United States. And that is the first philosophy that we must work against. And the Trump movement is full of libertarians. And, there are non-libertarian elements there, but overwhelmingly, the Trump movement is full of libertarians. And they like Donald Trump. And why do they like Trump? Because he's rich, and because he's a jerk. He's rude, and he doesn't care about other people, and he's selfish, and he's rich, and they want to be rich, and they want to be selfish, and that's Donald Trump. That is the problem on the right, and libertarianism must be defeated. We need to go all out to expose the lies of libertarianism. Effective Socialist Party organization. Write it down. Now, on the left, our primary opponent is synthetic leftism. Synthetic leftism. I'm just looking at the chat there. Synthetic leftism. What is synthetic leftism? Synthetic leftism is an ideology that speaks in the name of socialism, speaks in the name of communism, speaks in the name of Marxism, but does not believe in historical progress. The entire basis of the Marxist philosophy is historical progress, that human beings are advancing. We've gone from hunter-gatherer civilization to slavery, from slavery to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, from capitalism to socialism, and socialism will eventually lead to communism. Marxists believe that human beings are marching forward. Historical and dialectical materialism is the basis for Marxism. Marxists believe that human beings are always advancing to a higher stage, that we're developing higher modes of production, where we're advancing, we're working together, we're getting to a more efficient way of doing things, we're building a better world. Marxism is about historical progress, and Marxism is a populist ideology. It says that the majority, the working class, are exploited by a minority, the capitalists, and that in order to resolve this and have a rational society, the majority should rise up and seize control of the means of production and organize the economy rationally so that human growth and human progress can speed even further ahead. Marxism is a populist ideology. Marxism is an optimistic ideology. Marxism is centered on historical progress. Marxism is anti-imperialist. That is Marxism. Marxism is an optimistic, populist, anti-imperialist ideology. But what these people walking around dominating leftist circles believe is very, very, very different. The synthetic left is against historical progress. They say we've gone too far. There's too many people in the world. We need to reduce consumption. We need to roll back the wheels of history. Look at these deeply impoverished countries in Asia where they have, primitive feudal systems. It's so beautiful and it's not corrupted by the Western ways. And, oh my God, the Sandinistas want to build a road, and that's an attack on the indigenous people of Nicaragua. And, we need to go back to nature, and we need to reduce the human population, reduce consumption, and go back to some kind of try to restore hunter-gatherer civilization by eroding human progress. That's one thing they believe. Another thing they believe is populism is bad. Whenever you're mobilizing the majority to try and fight for their economic rights, that means you're a Nazi, right? And that elite, that if you say elite, that can't be a scientific Marxist word for bourgeoisie. That's coded anti-Semitism. That's conspiracy theories. That's another one, right? If you think that the USA invades countries for reasons other than just being polite and nice, you're pushing conspiracy theories, right? And that populism is bad. They believe the majority of workers in the United States are their enemies, that the working people that they're supposed to be fighting for are actually the enemy. They're all a bunch of racist Euro settlers. They have too much. They need to consume less. They need to be ashamed of their white privilege. They are anti-populist because they're against the majority of people, and they think any mass mobilization of the people is somehow Nazi. They are against historical progress. They think we've gone too far. We need to roll back the wheels of history. We need to reduce consumption. This is the synthetic left. And the synthetic left believes that destruction is in and of itself good, right? And they believe this not only in terms of physical destruction. They love, tearing things apart and violent protests and such, but also in terms of ideological, right? They reject Marxism-Leninism. They reject Marxism, and instead they favor postmodernism. Marxism-Leninism says there is a truth. Postmodernism says there is no truth, right? Marxism-Leninism is a narrative of human history and how it moves. Postmodernism says there is no narrative of human history. Postmodernism says the only good thing is deconstruction. Whenever you're taking ideas apart, that's good, right? If you're taking apart religions, taking apart philosophies, taking apart ideologies, that's good. That's called deconstruction, and that's good. But if you're building things, if you're building a narrative, if you're mobilizing people around ideas, if you're building a mass movement, that is totalitarian. And that is fascist, and it's oppressive. You say that right and wrong exists, why you are oppressing people, and that everything's a matter of opinion, there is no truth. That is what postmodernists believe. And this is synthetic leftism, anti-populism, anti-historical progress, destruction and deconstruction in and of itself being good. And this is our enemy on the left, right? We have an enemy on the right in libertarianism, and we have an enemy on the left in the synthetic left. And we're not going to be able to, do people think we're going to solve this with protests? We're going to go to Trump rallies with signs, down with libertarianism, Ayn Rand, that's not going to solve things. You think we're going to go, protest the synthetic left? We're going to go stand outside of Vosh's house with picket signs, there is truth in the world. The Soviet Union was not evil. No, that's not going to do anything. That's not what we want to do. We have to build an ideological pole. We have to build an ideological pole. I'm writing it down. Texts. Expensive. On Amazon. We have to build an ideological pole. We have to build an educational movement around constructive socialism, around socialism for the 21st century, and around anti-imperialism. We have to just build a core of people who understand Marxism, who understand that China is a socialist country and it's done many, many good things, and that who understand that, the USA attacking Venezuela is bad because Venezuela is trying to build a socialist society, and who understand that here in the United States, we need a government of action to fight for working families. That's what we need. We need a government of action to fight for working families. I have laid out many times, but I will lay out once again my 4-point plan to rescue the United States of America. If we were to implement these four steps, we would be on the brink of having socialism in the United States, and we would end the political and economic crisis. I don't know what that means, old gringo. We would end the economic and political crisis. The first thing we would do is we would have a mass mobilization to rebuild the country. All the unemployed would immediately be hired and put to work rebuilding highways, bridges, rebuilding new schools and universities, building new hospitals, building high-speed railway. We would have a mass program of state-funded reconstruction of the country and a mobilization of the population to do it. It would make Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration look like child's play. We would have a 5-year economic plan to completely rebuild America to be a new, high-tech, fully industrial country, right? That's what we would do. Every corner of the country having high-speed accessible internet, high-speed railway connecting the coasts. We would vastly rebuild the United States of America with a mass construction program. And how would we pay for it? That would be step number 2. Natural resources. All things that come from the earth of the country. Oil, natural gas, coal, timber. All natural resources in the United States would become public property. We would nationalize the material wealth of the country. And the profits from America's oil, from America's coal, from America's timber would go into the public budget. And that would pay for this reconstruction program many, many times over. No more would fracking companies enrich themselves while the people of Pennsylvania and Minnesota get poorer. Instead, as oil is pulled from the shale, as natural gas is pulled from the shale, the people of Minnesota and Pennsylvania would get the profits. It would go into the state budget. That would be step number 2, public control of natural resources. Step number 3 would be public control of banking. The banking system would be made into public property. The state would have a monopoly on the lending of money. We would get rid of the Federal Reserve, have only the federal government print money, as the Constitution says, and we would get rid of private banking. The state would lend money, and it would lend it strategically in the overall interest of the country. If you want a mortgage to buy a house, you make the case, look, I've got a wife and kids, I need a house, then the state will loan you the money to have your house, and you'll pay back to the state, and the interest goes into the public budget. You're going to start a business, you have to go to the state and say, my business will benefit the community. And if the state determines that your business will benefit the community, why, then they loan you the money to start your business, and then you pay it back, and the money goes into the public budget to pay for the reconstruction of the country. That's step number 3, is public control of banking. And finally, step number 4 would be enacting an economic Bill of Rights, like Roosevelt proposed in his last State of the Union address. An economic Bill of Rights guaranteeing every American the right to a job, the right to housing, the right to education, guaranteeing small business owners the right to flourish and have their business flourish in an atmosphere free of unfair competition and monopolies. And with those 4 steps, right, with the first step being a mass reconstruction program, the second step being public control of natural resources, the third step being state control of banking and strategic allotment of credit, and the fourth step being an enactment of an economic Bill of Rights. If we did those 4 things, at that point we would have a strong government, a government of action in the United States that would basically be on the brink of overturning capitalist property relations. That's what we would have. If we were to enact those four things. That is the economic program proposed by the Center for Political Innovation. If those four steps were enacted, the crisis would end. The police state would be rolled back. The prison industrial complex would be out of business. The Pentagon and the war profiteers would be out of business, right? All of American society would be reborn. Wages would start going up once again. Unemployment would be eradicated. A whole new life would be available to millions of Americans if those four steps were enacted. But in order to get those four steps enacted, right, you would have to have a mass movement of people that were willing to make it happen, right? Cults of personality. Necessary. You would have to have, at that point, you would have to have a mass movement of people that were willing to carry it out. Willing to make it real. Willing to, take risks and make it happen. And in order to do that, you have to engage in education. That is what I am dedicated to. I spent the first 10 years of my political life protesting. Not saying I regret it. Protested around a lot of good causes. Went to court with police brutality victims in Cleveland. I was protesting against all their big, ugly wars, even like wars like the one in Libya where all the trots and anarchists stayed home. Did some traveling. That was the first 10 years of my political life. Well, in this time, I am now dedicated to education. We must change the minds of the public. In order to get out of the crisis, we need an ideological shift. And I am building the Center for Political Innovation. And as we are opening up, we're planning to start having in real life events. It is very, very, very exciting. Very exciting. If you want to get involved with the Center for Political Innovation, send me an email. And we're moving ahead. We are going to repudiate libertarianism. We're going to repudiate synthetic leftism. We're going to push forward a program to build a government of action that will fight for working families. That's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to do. We're going to push anti-imperialism and oppose their wars. That is what is going to happen. So if you want to be involved, shoot me an email, calebmaupin@gmail.com. Yeah, that's what we got to do. It's time to change people's minds. It's time to change people's minds. It's time to reverse the frightful direction the country is going in. Okay. Biden handing. Okay. Back to Alabama. Alrighty, folks. So that concludes my opening remarks. Much appreciated. So now that I've poured some more unnamed Mexican fruit punch, now is the time for folks to give me their names and locations, and I call you out as I see you. I see Dust James is here, good friend of the program. There you go. JT24. Who else is here? Names and locations. Cleveland Pirate Alex, Queens, New York City, Los Angeles, Mo in Toronto, Brasique, Australia, Calgary, Canada, Montreal, Chaya, Robert Webb from Hawaii, Tristan from Maryland, very, very good. Marta in Poland, JT24 in Mississippi, John in Houston, Io Hillary in Manhattan, Heathrow, Spencer Richards, West Palm Beach, San Jose, hello from Detroit, California, Philippines, Tony in Oregon, West Palm Beach, Terre Haute, Max the Saxon Beltway, West Palm Beach, Australia, Puerto Rico, Rhode Island, James in England, New York City, California, Canada, Cleveland, Keaton Mansfield in Illinois. Welcome, Keaton. San Angelo Solidarity. That's great. That is really, really great. They're great out there in San Angelo. Mohsin from Iran. Very, very good. Quinn and Mary in Washington State. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Tacoma, Albany, New York, Nebraska, Tennessee, West Palm Beach, Detroit, Auckland, New Zealand, New Jersey, Union County, Kieran from San Diego, Mexico, Fort Lauderdale, Little Falls, New Jersey, Mindanao. The role of the person in history is overrated. There will be a right person for the job when needed. Role of individual. We can talk about that in history. All right. I know what you're getting at there, and I'll address that. No problem. Quebec, Illinois, Brian Schaefer, Juan from Mexico, Belly of the Beast, Eric Arbor is with us, Sam in Escondino. Eric Arbor's all over Twitter. You should check out his Twitter. He does a lot of tweeting. John from Albany, Dario and Tamara in Brooklyn. Welcome, Dario and Tamara. I'm in Brooklyn as well, in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. Pomona, California, San Diego, Brazil, Hong Kong, Missouri, SF Thomas, Maine, very, very good. We've got Sam Hyde in Maine. Sam Hyde. Who else is with us tonight? Names and locations. Naples, Florida, Harold Sullivan. Welcome, Harold. Michigan, Jacob Spangler in Michigan is with us tonight. Who else is with us tonight? It's a great crowd. Springfield, Missouri, Zach Campbell. Dust James is in Lee County, North Carolina. Very, very good. Very, 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 very good. Anybody else with us tonight? Anybody else? Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you, and then we will handle these super chats that have come in. We'll start hammering them out. Nashville. We got Marty in Illinois River. We got Las Vegas. Itzel X. Very good. Welcome, Itzel. Detroit. We got Detroit. That's good. Ahmed in Detroit. Lee County, Florida. Very, very good. Dylan in East Coast, North Carolina. Radioactive Comrade. Treasure Coast, OP. Very good. Very, very, very good. Anyone else before we wrap up the roll call? I'll call you out as I see you. Northern California. Keaton Mansfield's in the spirit of William Z. Foster. That's the way it should be. Argentina. Hawaii. Robert. Welcome. Treasure Coast, Florida. Kendall. Kendall is with us. She says, howdy, friends. Northern Michigan, A Better America. Glad you're here, folks in Northern Michigan. Good stuff, good stuff. Anyone else? Anybody else? Anybody else? Alaska. Arturo in Alaska is with us. All righty, folks. Glasgow, Scotland is with us. All right. All right. So now the super chats. And keep the super chats rolling in. I always answer the super chats. I don't know who that is, Niobium. I just don't know the name. I don't know who that is, so can't give you an answer there. That's my answer, is I don't know who that is, Niobium. But I will give you an answer. So the first super chat was from Io Hillary, and it was about Lula da Silva. Lula da Silva was the president of Brazil, and he was from the Workers' Party of Brazil, from the PT. And he was very much seen as a progressive. He provided free food in Brazil. Every person in Brazil, including people that were not even citizens, they had a free meal you could get at lunch every day. And there was a line, and if you wanted to get a free meal, right, you could get it, no questions asked. You got in a line, and they gave you, some basic food. Modern monetary theory, okay. And, he was seen as a progressive, an ally of the labor unions, from the Workers' Party. I will never forget a conversation that I had when I was in college with students from Brazil. It was one of the most educational political conversations I have ever had in my life, and it was with some college students from my college who were from Brazil. And I asked them about Lula da Silva, and they said to me, he's awful. He's awful. Lula da Silva is awful. And I said, really? And they said, oh, he's just horrible. Did you know he used to deliver packages for a living? Brazil, we're a civilized nation, and we're led by somebody who delivered packages for a living. It's so awful. Blatant classism there. And I said, well, why do people keep voting for him if he's so popular? And they said, in Brazil, we have this law that everybody has to vote. I said, what do you mean? I said, so you're required to vote in Brazil. So all these poor people who don't understand politics are always voting. And they shouldn't be voting, and and that's the case. I said, wow, okay. And I said, but why do all these people that you think shouldn't be voting, why do they vote for Lula da Silva? And they said, he gives them all jobs. That told me everything I needed to know. It was a very, very beautiful conversation. Writing down the debate right-wingers Right. But that was my conversation. Lula da Silva was a left-wing president. But the thing about Lula da Silva, and I do remember this, when Barack Obama was running for president, I remember during one of his town hall Q&As, when he was running for president, somebody got up and they said, "I am from Venezuela. Hugo Chavez is a brutal dictator," and I remember, Barack Obama said, "Yes, I hear you, ma'am. I hear you. Barack Obama's brutal. Hugo Chavez is a brutal dictator. I like Lula da Silva. I like Lula da Silva. He's socialist, but he's not a dictator like Hugo Chavez." And there was an element of truth in that. What he was saying was that, Lula da Silva was very much, Lula da Silva was very much a middle of the road kind of guy. He didn't nationalize things. 4-point plan sounds great. How would it resolve toxic degradation of our planet? All right. Writing that down. 4-point plan, toxic degradation. And, Lula da Silva never went hard left when he was president. He wasn't nationalizing things. He was friendly with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, was friendly with Cuba, but he was also friendly with the United States, he was a center leftist, right? He was not a hard leftist. He was not a hardliner. Yes, most of my Brazilian friends in San Diego hate Lula da Silva. Okay, well, there you go. But he was not hard left. He was moderate left, and he left office, and he was replaced by Dilma Rousseff. Now, Dilma Rousseff, she was actually, at one point, an armed resistance fighter. She was in a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group that fought against the military junta that ruled Brazil. So she's got some street cred. But, she was much like Lula da Silva. She was part of the Workers' Party, moderate, going to have some social programs, more of a social democrat, and not fully anti-imperialist. Some anti-imperialism, mixed bag, right? That was that situation. Now, I went to Brazil in 2016 when Brazil was in the middle of a political crisis. And what was going on was the Brazilian right wing impeached Dilma Rousseff. They drove her out of office, on allegations of corruption. And because the oil prices had dropped significantly and the economy of Brazil was suffering, the right wing in Brazil played up this idea that Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff and the Workers' Party were corrupt. They handed out government contracts to their friends or something like that. And after Dilma Rousseff left office, they have, her vice president became president. His name was Michel Temer. I'm actually photographed with Michel Temer. I have met Michel Temer. I have shaken Michel Temer's hand. When I was invited to speak at the Trade Union Center, of Brazil, I was a keynote speaker at one of their platforms, and I actually shook hands with the president of Brazil, the least popular president, Michel Temer, which I think is hilarious. But anyhow, Michel Temer was in, and now they have the right-wing demagogue Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro was a right-wing extremist. He's tied to paramilitary groups that murder communists, and he's a right-winger, and he's been just wrecking Brazil's economy. He's just been doing awful. It's just been a nightmare. So, in order to make sure that Bolsonaro, this right-wing demagogue, got elected, they put Lula da Silva in prison, and they charged him with corruption. But now, we know that was a sham trial, that the judge and the prosecutor were texting each other throughout the entire trial. They were texting each other, coordinating to make sure that Lula da Silva was convicted. And that in the texts, the prosecutor even admitted his case was weak and he didn't think that Lula da Silva was guilty. Those texts eventually were released, but in order to prevent Lula da Silva from running for president against Bolsonaro, they framed him up for corruption, gave him a sham trial, and locked him in jail. So Lula da Silva, the former president, who took kind of a middle-of-the-road position, they put him in prison. Well, those texts, between the judge and the prosecutor were released, and ultimately, Lula da Silva was released from prison. Writing it down. were released from prison. So, while Lula da Silva was in prison, his views significantly shifted to the left. Lula da Silva became a big supporter of North Korea and their right to nuclear proliferation. He said that his mistake while he was president was not suppressing the right wing, not moving in a more radical direction like Venezuela. He speaks of Venezuela as his comrades. And so Lula da Silva, as a result of being in prison, has become more radical. And is probably going to run for president again against Bolsonaro, and polls show he would probably win because his policies were so good. But he's significantly shifted to the left, and his party, the Workers' Party, has also significantly shifted to the left. The Communist Party of Brazil has a lot more influence than it used to. And so it appears that Lula da Silva may be running against Bolsonaro very soon, and if he wins, Brazil will be shifting much further to the left than they were, during his previous presidency. Because, and this is a classic example. This is what always happens, right? Abraham Lincoln didn't want to abolish slavery, but the right-wing slaveholders were so determined to not have their slavery restrained. Abraham Lincoln said, I'm not going to abolish slavery, but we're not going to have any new slave states. We're not going to force all the states to cooperate with your fugitive slave law. And the right wing was so extreme, the property owners, the slave owners, were so extreme, and they reacted in such extreme, in such an extreme manner to the threat to their private property and their slavery that we got the Second American Revolution. And in Brazil, look, Lula da Silva was a moderate, right? He wasn't going to nationalize things. He wasn't going to move Brazil to a full-on socialist economy. But then the right wing were so extreme, put him in prison, for Christ's sakes. Now, there you go. And this is a common pattern. The capitalists are so desperate to hold on to their profits that often they shoot themselves in the foot, right? World War II, right? Look, the Nazis and, the capitalists were so determined, so afraid of the threat to their system, they set up a fascist government in Germany and a fascist government in Italy. And then, you had World War II, and pretty soon you had communism in Eastern Europe, and you had communism in China and on the Korean Peninsula. Well, that was a result of the capitalists getting so desperate to save their system that they, and this is generally what happens, right? The capitalists overreact to they consider the most modest reforms to be an attack on them somehow, and then they give birth to revolutionary currents that might not have otherwise emerged. Now, somebody asked about Stalin cost Trotsky Warsaw in 1920. I don't know what that's about. I do know that Trotsky was assigned to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was, involved a lot of, Polish territory and such. Then Trotsky ruined that. And he ruined the negotiations of Brest-Litovsk. The Russian Civil War was happening, and Trotsky was like the front man for the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. So I don't know exactly what that is referring to there, but there you go. Thoughts on the Bush years? The Bush years were my period of radicalization, I would say. I lived in a very small town that was almost all Republicans and conservatives. I had to sit through a number of very, support the troops and got to support the wars and, kind of dogmatically patriotic ceremonies, and heard a lot of right-wing rants. I had a teacher who said that Islam was an evil religion. I had another teacher who, I was in a very right-wing town. Most of the people were evangelical Christians, and it was in that context I started getting interested in politics and started getting interested in Marxism and communism. So the Bush years very much radicalized me. And what was different about the Bush years was that the Bush years were very, Bush was being supported by the mainstream. The anti-Bush people were anti-establishment. The right wing, they had the mainstream support. And the left wing, if you were on the left, you were, and what was interesting is during the Bush years, and thank you, Olympia Logic. During the Bush years, if you were anti-Bush, you were like the other, right? It's funny because now, there'd be anti-war protests in Washington, D.C., and, it was anyone who was against the war. And it was generally communist groups that led those protests, kind of like during the 60s, right? Not like now. There was no hashtag to call those protests. I would go to these protests in D.C. When I was in college. I went to the anti-war protests against the war in Iraq. And there, the Answer Coalition or United for Peace and Justice would call a big rally in D.C. And everyone would come out, and the Lyndon LaRouche followers would be, in one place. The Libertarian Party would be there, and the Constitution Party, and it was just a collection of anybody who was against the status quo in the United States, and it would just be all the dissidents would gather, and it was communists were the biggest current. Because coming out of the Cold War, communists were the main opposition in the United States. So communists led it. There'd be a million communists selling their papers. But the LaRouche people would be there, and they'd have their choir singing. And the libertarian candidates for office would be there leafleting and telling you to vote for them or sign a petition to get the Libertarian Party on the ballot. And, Alex Jones conspiracy kind of people would be there with their 9/11 truth stuff. And we were all considered to be a bunch of freaks, right? And, most Americans, maybe they didn't, maybe they supported the Iraq War, or they felt like, well, we shouldn't have invaded to begin with, but, we can't leave, right? The Pottery Barn rule. John Kerry said it was the Pottery Barn rule. If you break it, it's yours. And that was how it was, right? And what's funny, because now, like, the people in that cage have all divided, right? The LaRoucheites, they supported Trump. Libertarians tend to support Trump. Constitution Party and people like that tend to support Trump and are very active in the Republican Party. Meanwhile, all the socialists tend to be in with the Democrat, right? And it's weird because we were all just, anybody who was like not for the status quo was in the same cage. Now we're all kind of divided. And the Iraq War movement, it was interesting because it was like the whole establishment was kind of ignoring it, and that was, it was weird. The Iraq War protests, it was like, CNN was not showing them on TV very much. They would barely, they had to every so often show the protests, but they didn't, wasn't anything like now, CNN will have their cameraman live from inside the Black Lives Matter. It wasn't like that at all. Right? The Iraq War movement, it was like it happened, it was there. They would portray, the protesters as crazy, unpatriotic, and, Fox was the most vicious to the protesters, but, CNN wasn't particularly nice to them either. It was very, very interesting. It was a different time. Very, very different time. And the other thing was that, while socialism was far less popular in the United States, barely anybody was calling themselves a socialist. It was a minority, of people. It was nowhere near, the rise of Bernie Sanders has made socialism far more popular. Almost everyone who was a socialist was more or less anti-imperialist, right? Maybe they, it's a lot of these Trotskyites and stuff, but they at least knew that if CNN says that, that something's true, you might have to fact check it. The kind of things that Vosh says, where it's like, like tankies are just the same as Nazis. Nobody thought that, right? They didn't agree with, there were a lot of Trotskyites and anarchists and stuff. But they all knew that tankies were in the same side as them. There was none of this, like, tankies are the same as Nazis, crypto-fascists. That stuff wasn't going on. You didn't get very much of that. But that's history, right? And we've moved on, you know what I mean? Times have changed, and changing times. Lenin said that if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must change in 24 hours, right? New circumstances require new tactics, and the situation has vastly changed. Vastly changed. And what is needed now is a mass socialist educational movement to get to the masses. That's what's needed. It's not a new protest movement to try and compete with George Soros's hashtags. It's not, it's not tailing after whatever the trendy, hip, liberal, progressive thing is. We need a solid core of people who understand Marxism and socialism and are going around popularizing anti-imperialism. We need a government of action to fight for working families. That's what we need in this time. And yeah, during the Bush years, this wouldn't have made sense. What I'm advocating, it wouldn't have made sense in the Bush years. Things have changed. All right. Malthusianism in the old left. Chaya, I think you're referring to the fact that the syndicalist movement discouraged people from having children. And this is, it was syndicalists mainly. William Z. Foster, when he was a syndicalist, and others, they urged people not to have children because if the population increased, there would be higher competition for jobs. That was the feeling, right? And William Z. Foster, in his pamphlet, Syndicalism, he makes this argument that the more people that exist, the more people are competing for jobs, and so the wages of workers go down. And the idea was, before the revolution, no one should have any children. One, because you should be a fanatical syndicalist revolutionary, and that fits the syndicalist current. The syndicalists didn't want to build, a mass revolutionary movement that had like families in it. They wanted to build like a cult of like dedicated, lumpen elements, warrior, so they can't be having kids, right? They got to be full time. There was part of that was you shouldn't have children because you got to be a dedicated syndicalist. The syndicalists, and then you don't have children under capitalism because of the fact that, that it just drives wages down. But then after the revolution, it becomes the duty to populate. And so the idea is that after the revolution, there will be mass baby making festivals or something to highly populate the world. We need unnamed diet beverage of action. Very funny, Alex. But that was the idea, I think. That was the syndicalist movement. Marx vehemently argued against Malthus, right? I mean, and ripped him to shreds in Theories of Surplus Value, Capital Volume 4. And I wouldn't even really call that Malthusianism as much as it was a belief that procreation under capitalism had a negative effect. That was the belief in the syndicalist movement. It was not the belief of Marxist-Leninists and social democrats, but it was in the syndicalist current. That was a belief, right? That the birth rate should decrease, in order to, and we should build groups of people who don't have kids. It's also interesting is that Mao, before Mao became a communist, he was an anarchist. He was not a syndicalist. He was not he was a follower of Kropotkin, Peter Kropotkin, the conquest of bread, the peasant anarchist. And in Mao's New People's Study Group, which was Mao's Kropotkinist organization that he was the leader of, they also had the same rule about not procreating and being sexually chaste. Which is interesting. This apparently was a feeling among revolutionaries. One thing that's interesting is during this time, socialists, communists, a lot of them didn't believe in alcohol, right? John Reed did not drink alcohol. Charles Ruthenberg, who was the founder of the Communist Party, one of the early leaders of the Communist Party, he didn't drink alcohol, and there was a feeling that alcohol was a tool of the bosses, and that was very widespread in the socialist movement as well, right? And because feminism, and this is interesting, but the movement for the women's right to vote and the movement to ban alcohol often walked hand in hand. One of the biggest proponents, one of the earliest proponents of women's right to vote was a woman named Carrie Nation, and she was this suffragist. She was an early suffragist, Carrie Nation, who went around giving speeches about the right of women to vote. And she also went around giving speeches urging people not to drink alcohol, and she lobbied for prohibition. It's complicated. These things are complicated, right? So these things are very, very complicated. That's all we can really say about all of this. But yeah, the syndicalist movement, the syndicalists, like that's George Sorel, that's those folks push the idea you shouldn't have children. They pushed that idea very, very hard. I wouldn't call it Malthusian necessarily, but they pushed it in their own way. And it did, apparently in France, significantly result in dropping the birth rate. Alrighty. Someone sent me 3 names. Thomas Sowell, I don't know who that is. Michael Hudson, he's a Marxist economist. He teaches Marxist economics in Beijing. He's written a lot about debt and all of that. And Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis Varoufakis is also he's more of a social democratic economist. All those people have books and stuff. So there you go. All right. Did RT discover you during Occupy? Technically, no. I think the first interview I did with RT was several months before Occupy Wall Street. And I was a big fan of RT for a long time before I ever did an interview with them. I think the first RT, well, I don't want to get into that. Well, no, the first RT news report I ever saw was like in 2007, and it was about how there was a truck dealership that was giving away an AK-47 with every truck it sold, and I thought that was amusing. I found it on YouTube. That was like 2007, I think I found that. It might have been later than that. It was like more maybe 2010. But anyway, that was the first time I'd heard of RT. I saw them on YouTube. But I was working with a certain organization, and that organization, they were frequently brought on RT as guests. I was not, but I was working with people who were appearing on RT. I worked with former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark and his International Action Center, and various spokespersons for the International Action Center appeared on RT all the time. So, I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I think you can figure who those folks were. And I worked with them, and then about maybe 4 or 5 months before Occupy Wall Street was the first time I had ever appeared on RT. So there you go. Can the original conservative values of true socialism be used to win over Christian conservatives? No, I don't think so. Well, not really. I don't think so. I think social issues should be a matter of personal choice. I think if you want to smoke weed, you want to drink alcohol, it's your business. And I don't think it's my job as a socialist to try and convince you not to do that, right? That's your life. And the same goes for other issues, right? If you're against abortion, don't have one. But it shouldn't be illegal. If you're against gay marriage, right? If you're a Muslim or a conservative Christian who feels gay marriage is wrong, don't get gay married. But generally, in the USA, the way our culture is, we tend to have more of a civil liberties approach on these things, and we don't have a state religion. And so in the United States, I think that it's important that when it comes to social issues that we have a live and let live attitude. Now, that also means, though, that, look, I mean, I will work with people. And this is one thing that I've said about the Center for Political Innovation over and over and over again. I will work with people who are socially conservative, right? I mean, and I'm not ashamed of that, right? The Center for Political Innovation is about promoting socialism. It's about defeating the synthetic left. It's about defeating libertarianism, promoting anti-imperialism. And, if you think abortion is wrong and should be illegal, I'm going to disagree with you. I think it should be legal, but you're welcome in the Center for Political Innovation. If you think that gay marriage is wrong and should be illegal, again, I am going to disagree with you, but you're welcome. And it is about getting past the culture wars, right? I want people that might be conservative, but understand that socialism is the answer and are open to constructive socialism. They're welcome, right? I'm not interested in waging a culture war. I'm done with the culture war. I'm interested in promoting socialist economics and anti-imperialism. That's my perspective, and I'm sure that gets me canceled. But all the people who cancel me for that are not people that would want to organize with me anyway. They wouldn't want to build this educational think tank. Sorry, my nose is like driving me crazy. Allergies this time of year, man. Sorry about that. All right. Okay. All right. Next question. Would a PLA invasion of tank Taiwan's economy? Folks, if China were in a situation where it was like forced to militarily retake Taiwan, that would be a nightmare for so many reasons. We don't want that. I think Taiwan will eventually rejoin the mainland. I think it will. But it won't do it because of military force. I think it'll do it because it will be in its economic interest. I think, Taiwan is China. It has been China for thousands of years. Its legal name is the Republic of China. And eventually Taiwan will join the mainland. And I think it'll just simply be a matter of the fact that China's economy is soaring ahead while Western capitalism is falling apart. So why wouldn't it? Would be in Taiwan's economic interest to join with the mainland and be rejoined and have one government. And so but a military retaking of Taiwan would be a very bad situation. Why? Because the United States would immediately jump on that and say, the Chinese are imperialists, and the Taiwan has bought lots of weapons from the United States, even though the United States doesn't recognize them. They still give them lots of weapons, and it would be a nightmare. We don't want that. We want peace in the Pacific. We want peace in the Pacific. So, I really hope that what you're describing there never happens. Capital Volume 3. Well, the important thing to remember, so now Capital Volume 1 was actually written by Karl Marx, right? And Capital Volume 1 is where Karl Marx lays out, what a commodity is, where the value of a commodity comes from. Capital Volume 1, you have the general law of capitalist accumulation. You have the competition of workers with machines. And you also have the primitive accumulation, where Karl Marx explains how capitalism originated, right? That people, this is the most annoying thing, right? We've all heard this, and Marx rips this to shreds, but we've all heard over and over again. We've heard over and over again, the rich worked for what they have, Why should we punish Rockefeller and Carnegie and DuPont and Bill Gates and George, and Jeff Bezos and all George Soros? All these, they just worked for what they have. No, they didn't. Capitalism began with mass theft, and it started out in Europe, with the clearing of the commons, where they turned the feudal commons, the feudal estates where the peasants lived and had guaranteed guaranteed place to live. They turned them into private property and cleared the commons. And that was and the clearing of the Scottish Highlands, mass genocide in Scotland where they cleared the Scottish Highlands. And the clearances and all of that. And then they started, colonizing Africa and colonizing, the Americas. And then they had the transatlantic slave trade. And the origins of capitalism did not involve everyone just being equal and some people working harder than others and rising to the top. And Marx rips that to shreds. I believe it's chapter 8 of Capital Volume 1. It's on primitive accumulation. And he talks about, when King Henry VIII was the leader of Britain, there were mass executions of homeless people. If you were homeless, if you were a vagabond, then you got the death penalty. They hung you, and thousands of people got the death penalty just for being homeless, right? That's how capitalism began, the clearing of the commons, the turning of serfs into proletarians. And it was very brutal and ugly. And Marx, does a very good job. That's Capital Volume 1, right? Capital Volume 2, 3, and 4 were not actually written by Marx. They took Marx's notes, right? And Engels, and then later Karl Kautsky put together 3 more volumes based on Karl Marx's notes. I mean, Theories of Surplus Value, that's, Marx's notes on all the different, I don't know enough about that, Jared. I really just don't know enough about that kind of thing. All of, Marx's notes on different economists, the physiocrats, Malthus, his refutation of Malthusianism, that's in Theories of Surplus Value. His understanding of Adam Smith and his what he takes from Adam Smith and learns from Adam Smith, but also where he critiques Adam Smith, and Marx's critique of all the different economists, right? That's in there. Grundrisse. The Grundrisse is another volume of Capital, right? And this is Karl Kautsky, Engels, Bernstein, others editing the notes that Karl Marx left in his notebooks and putting them together. And that's the 4 volumes of Capital. So there you go. All right. How has the nature of imperialism changed in the last 25 years? And is the USA using Afghanistan to go after the Chinese? Well, on the second question, I have long maintained that the strategy of the United States in Afghanistan has been to maintain Afghanistan as a strategic epicenter of chaos. Afghanistan, the instability there spills over the border into China, it spills over the border into up north into Russia, and it spills over the border into Iran. And that by having drug gangs and terrorist groups operating there and being very unstable, Afghanistan causes a problem for 3 major geopolitical rivals of the United States. And keeping it unstable is the goal, and that the military presence of the United States is there to make sure that China and Iran don't economically develop Afghanistan and stabilize it, right? Because if the USA were to pull its forces out of there, then Iran would probably be able to do, and China would work with them to do what Iran has done in Iraq. Iran has sent, forces into Iraq with the permission of the government to help stabilize the country. And if the United States were not there, Iran might be able to send some forces into Afghanistan, work with China, stabilize Afghanistan. USA doesn't want that. That's been my position. And yeah, to go after China, go after Iran, that's what they're doing. Now the nature of imperialism changed in the last 25 years. Look, the main thing that we have seen is that that we're seeing this kind of weird moment where the imperialists, we're seeing documents from the IMF and the World Bank where they're criticizing themselves and saying that they are too neoliberal. They're too neoliberal. They're trying to, develop programs and policies that are less blatantly austere. But at the same time, probably the primary factor in the last 25 years is that the Eurasian alternative, Russia and China, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, is gotten so much stronger. Look, 25 years ago, you're talking the 90s, there was no opposition to U.S. imperialism. U.S. imperialism
I mean, look, if they canceled Cuba, and Cuba like had massive food shortages and stuff, they canceled North Korea, and millions of people starved to death, right? Um, I mean, it was like Russia and China, I mean, weren't really going to be able to oppose them, and that's not how it is now. The birth of Bolivarian socialism, the rise of Putin and his economic program of restructuring Russia's economy to once again be centered around the state. All of this has been a big game changer. I wrote an essay about 1999, the year 1999, and how a number of things happened around 1999. You had a decade of neoliberalism. And in 1999, you started to see the very beginning of a shift, right? You had Putin coming to power in Russia, Hugo Chavez coming to power in Venezuela. Things were starting to shift in 1999. Neoliberal, libertarian, free market economics had failed for a decade, and the world was starting to react against it. Very interesting stuff. All right. Okay. The Synthetic Left book. I mean, I've got a draft of it written, and I'm updating it because I'll only be able to write the Synthetic Left book once, so I need to get it right. Right. I need to get it right, and that means I need to go over it. Right. I take my job very seriously. So there you go. All righty. How do you make protest painful for the capitalists? I'm not leading protests, and I'm not advising anyone about how to protest at this time. I'm focused on educational work. I mean, obviously, look, historically, strikes have been very painful for capitalists. Boycotts have been very painful for capitalists. There you go. Property damage might be painful for like small business owners, but at the end of the day, the big capitalists aren't really threatened by property damage very much. All right. The libertarian to fascist pipeline. Yes. Well, it's a bigger pipeline than that. But yeah, I mean, first of all, libertarian circles have long had fascists in them, right? I mean, white supremacists, people like that. Look, Ron Paul, look at his newsletters, the militia movement. And look, I mean, in Cleveland, the head like libertarian of Cleveland is a guy, David Macko, who's a Holocaust denier and hangs out with white supremacists and stuff. And Ron Paul, he's a big fan of the John Birch Society and, white nationalist kind of people, for a long time hung out in the libertarian movement. Now, since the rise of Richard Spencer and like the alt-right becoming more of a thing, that's changed. Right now, libertarian circles are much less open, but for a long time, libertarians were just people that, they hate communists. Everything communist is evil. Communist. That's what fascists think, right? And on top of that, they were people that were more to the right economically of the Republican Party. They thought the Republican Party was not far right wing enough. So yeah, you had people that were sympathetic to fascistic ideas in libertarian circles. Now, in terms of the libertarian to fascist pipeline, it's a more complicated pipeline than that. It's generally there's a lot of Americans who come from conservative families, right? And again, BreadTube doesn't care about these people, doesn't think about these people. There's many people in the United States who've never met a socialist, never met a communist, can't understand why anyone would be one, grew up in a household where socialism and communism is pure evil. I mean, so people that grow up in right-wing families, again, BreadTube has decided that, they're all just canceled and, no one should ever talk to them. And, I swear these people have never even met a conservative, but anyway, all right, Myanmar, we'll talk about it. But anyway, so, there's a lot of people who grow up in like deeply conservative, evangelical, neoconservative families, right? And what happened was you had the rise of the New Atheist movement. I don't know if folks remember the New Atheist movement. But the New Atheists, right? That was Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris, and it was this suddenly all over American TV and media, and especially on the internet, you had atheism, and evangelicals who believe that the Bible is literally true, every word in the Bible is literally absolutely true. They were just these, they ripped the evangelical thing to shreds. So you had a lot of young men who grew up in conservative families who became new atheists. And new atheism is a very smug thing. It's like, I'm smarter than you. All these people that are religious, they're dumb, and I'm smart. That's basically the belief of new atheists. Someone jokingly once said to me, I'm Richard Dawkins, and my next book will be called The 25 Greatest Mistakes of Everyone Else. And it's like there's a kind of smugness in new atheism, right? It's, everyone who's not a new atheist, everyone's just stupid, right? So that's the new atheist current. So new atheism has this kind of intellectual smugness to it. And so does libertarianism, right? Libertarians think that they're the only people that have ever understood economics. Well, clearly, if you've read anything, you would know that, minimum wage is bad and that the free market, libertarians think that, because no one knows anything about economics in the United States. So libertarians, they read like basic economics, right? Economics 101, and it pushes like the free market narrative, people voting with their dollars, etc. So libertarians, it was like that was the next stage. If you think you're smarter than everyone else who's religious, next you're smarter than anyone who wouldn't be a libertarian. Libertarianism is like the next stage, and it's all over the internet, right? So you go from new atheist to libertarian. But then after a while, right, libertarianism, there's some holes in it, right? You can't have affirmative action. You can't have the government, favor some groups over others, and libertarian economics, you have to say racism isn't real if you want to be a libertarian, right? Because, affirmative action, can't have it because that would be the government helping some people and overcoming historic injustice. You can't have that, and there can't be, lingering race, so you have to say that racism isn't real. That's like, in order to be a libertarian, like it's like a conclusion you have to basically come to, which is that there is no unequal opportunity. There's not historical injustice. No. And people are rich because they work hard and they're just smarter than everybody else. People are poor, So that leads you, if you take libertarianism to its conclusion, where there is no historical injustice, the free market creates this meritocracy where the smartest people get to the top, in order to justify the libertarian narrative, right? Because there can't be anything wrong with capitalism, and that's how libertarians are. So the fact that some communities are more impoverished than others, it has to be blamed on, and that's where you start getting the racial pseudoscience, right? And they start arguing that some races are just, intellectually inferior to other races, etc. And that's like the logical conclusion to it. And so that's like the libertarian to fascist pipeline. And it's usually new atheist, it's conservative family, conservative neocon upbringing, to libertarian, to new atheist to libertarian, libertarian to alt-right. And that's a very common, that's like, I know people who went through that pattern. I can think of people that I'm not friends with them now, but in college, I knew many young men who I saw them, I observed them go through this pattern. And it's very common, right? It's a common pattern. And social media is a big part of it, right? It wouldn't happen without access to the internet. Without access to the internet, without the computer revolution, they would still be evangelicals in stage one, right? They'd be neocon evangelicals, but, the internet cured them of being neocon evangelicals, made them new atheists, and then they became libertarians, and now they're racists. Yeah, and it's kind of old news, actually, but it happens. You have, I don't even know what that means. I don't know what that means, Jackie, but I thank you. I'm glad you like what I have to say, Jackie. I appreciate it. Next super chat. What would an effective socialist party in the United States, what would be its organizational structure? We are nowhere near having an effective socialist party in the United States. We're nowhere near that, right? An effective socialist party in the United States would have millions of people. It would have people in Congress. It would have people elected to office throughout the country. It would have labor unions that it controlled. It would have, associations and communities. We don't have such a thing right now. We have a lot of things that aspire to be that. That's what we have, but we don't have an effective socialist party. So we're nowhere near, that. We have to change the consciousness. We have to fight synthetic leftism. We have to fight libertarianism, right? And until we change the consciousness, we are nowhere near that. And I will be honest, folks, democratic centralism. I made this point before, might as well make it again. It's one of my key points. What is democratic centralism? What is democratic centralism? Democratic centralism is this theory that Lenin came up with. Skippy the Bear thinks it's an economic theory because he's an idiot. But no, it's a theory about how do you run a political party, right? Can the U.S. labor movement be declared dead in 2021? All right, writing it down. Dead. All righty. Democratic centralism. So in Russia, they had a Marxist party, the Mensheviks, and it was like a regular political party. You agree with these points, you join, you pay your dues, that's it. Lenin said we need a more effective organization. We need a more effective political party. We need a party of new type. And this party of new type would engage in agitation to the broad masses, stirring them up to confrontation, and propaganda, teaching communism to the advanced. And this party of new type would have democratic centralism. And what democratic centralism meant was that every member of the party, would be obligated to carry out decisions that were made. Once the group made a decision, if you disagreed or agreed, you still were obligated to carry it out, right? And even if you disagreed, once the group made a decision through its process, every member was obligated to carry it out. And it also meant that there was a unified face to the masses, that the party, they concluded what their position was, and then only one message went out in the name of the party, right? You might think one thing and somebody else might think one thing, but there's one unified party voice. There's a party press that speaks for the entire organization, a unified face to the masses. You keep your fighting internal. When you reach a conclusion, everyone carries it out. That's democratic centralism. And the reason Lenin came up with democratic centralism is because there were a lot of great revolutionary leaders in Russia, like Bukharin, like Zinoviev, like Stalin, like Trotsky, like, a lot of these great revolutionaries in Russia who had big followings. They had very, very big followings. And Lenin wanted to combine the strength of all these great revolutionary leaders into one organization. And so he got all the big names, all the great, well-respected organizers in Russia into one organization, and he got them to combine their strength, by even if, when they reached a conclusion, they all carried it out. And it was a way of combining the energy and strength of all of these dynamic leaders and in order to get shit done. That was what democratic centralism meant. And many times, he formed a central committee. He went to all the revolutionary leaders and he invited them to join central committees. Serious socialists. Central committees. And these central committees that were formed, that the central committee that was formed was the center, of the Bolshevik Party, was this central committee. Many times, Lenin was outvoted on the central committee. Lenin wanted one thing, and the rest of the central committee voted another way, and Lenin was overruled, right? And that was what democratic centralism was. It was about making a more effective political organization where everyone's obligated to carry out the decision, and you can combine the strength of all the leaders of the group in order to get stuff done. That is what democratic centralism is, okay? And it worked very, very well, and the Bolsheviks took power. What democratic centralism in the United States, as practiced by communist groups, means is something very, very different. Generally, in the United States, what democratic centralism means is that communist parties can have only one smart person in them, right? There is one guy who is considered the great revolutionary theoretician, and he starts a group, and everyone has to agree with his exact interpretation of all of world history and all of economics and all of Marxism. If that guy says China's socialist, everyone in the group must think China's socialist. If that guy thinks China's not socialist, everyone in the group must think China's not socialist. This guy says we're going to do that, everyone must agree with what that guy does. And if you disagree, you either learn not to think and you learn to just obey that guy, or you go and start your own group. And that's why we have a million groups, because democratic centralism in the United States has come to mean basically communist parties have to be cults. That's basically what it has come to mean. Basically that everybody in the group, everyone in the group must agree on everything. And, and if you don't agree about one thing, you have to start a new group. That's the opposite of what Lenin meant democratic centralism to mean. Lenin meant democratic centralism to be a method for all kinds of brilliant and effective organizers to be in the same organization. What democratic centralism has degenerated into in the United States is the opposite. It's why we have a million different organizations. And it's really sad. All the new left groups, I'll just be real with you, all the new left groups are led by white men. They are led by white men. There's a white man that is in charge of all these groups. And they are made up primarily of white middle-class people who used to protest the Vietnam War and used to protest for civil rights. And they, when it stopped being hip and cool to be a communist, they never got the memo and they just kept doing it and, whatever. The groups are overwhelmingly white people. I mean, there are people of color, but it's overwhelmingly white people. And they all think that their leader, their white male leader, that he truly understands black people. And it's weird. And they'll sit there and be like, oh, our leader, he totally, there's never been a white man who understands black people more than our leader. I mean, and I've heard this, there's Trotskyist groups that are like this. There's Maoist groups that are like this. It's wacky. And they sit there and they're all middle-class white people and they're all old and they have a leader and they all go on and on about how much their leader understands black people. He truly understands the black people. And it's like, it's a group of white people centered around one white guy who their fantasy is that someday all of the black people of the United States will rally around their white guy leader. That's basically what communist groups in the United States have degenerated into. There's a few exceptions. And they're all falling apart now because their members are all old and, and dying and becoming less politically effective. That's basically communist groups in the United States. And it's nuts. And it's a white savior complex. And it's a cult of personality, and it's all in the name of democratic centralism, right? It's all in the name of democratic centralism, right? We can only have one leader in a group because, democratic centralism. We all have to have one face to the masses, and it's a nightmare. So I think that what democratic centralism means needs to be re-examined. Look, the Center for Political Innovation that I'm building is not a democratic centralist organization. It is not a party. It is a think tank, and it is not democratic centralist in the way it's set up. It's simply not. Because democratic centralism, as applied in the United States, is a nightmare. It's a nightmare, right? It doesn't, it's been the nail in the coffin of the American left. It needs to be re-examined. None of these groups are effective in their organizing methods. None of them, okay? I'll just be real. None of them have a mass base. None of them have millions of people following, except for maybe DSA, but they're not revolutionary. DSA is not, they're not a revolutionary group. There's revolutionaries in DSA, but DSA overall is a reformist social democratic group. There's good, there's different forces in it, but none of these groups are really getting shit done. Okay? And so on that basis, the way organizations are set up and structured needs to be re-examined, okay? And it needs to be re-examined because it's not working. Starting a democratic centralist party in the United States, if that formula was the formula to actually achieving something, it would have worked by now. And it's not working. So I hate to be the voice of, the voice of negativity there, but I'm just telling you the facts. Someone says that some of these books are very expensive on Amazon. Well, I know that, and a lot of these old communist books are very expensive. I actually worked with Red Star Publishers to arrange for them to reprint The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. And now it's very affordable, but for a while that book was very rare and it was very hard to find, and so it was very expensive. And that's one thing that, a lot of these, they're good online publishers, Red Star Publishers, others. They have taken some of these old textbooks and made them available. You can get, History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. It's affordable. You can get the History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course. It's available. A lot of these are online as PDFs. You can even download them. So there you go. Is cult of personality necessary? No. No, it is not. Well, let me back up. No, not in the sense of Stalin or Mao or Fidel Castro, not in the sense of one great charismatic leader, but people do like personalities. I'll be real, right? People like personalities. People sometimes, look, people want to know, people like people, right? And so people, when you watch a movie, it has characters in it. You get to know those characters. So, as far as a full-blown, worship the great leader, Obviously, that's not necessary, but in politics, look, I mean, look, people like, Trump's supporters. They like Trump, right? Is it a cult of personality? I mean, they build a cult of personality around political leaders all the time. If that's what you mean by cult of personality, it depends, right? Depends what you mean by it. But people are interested in personalities, and politics can't be unpersonal. I mean, there's going to be personalities in politics. Some people are more charismatic than others, etc. One thing I noticed in Venezuela is that the Bolivarian movement has many different personalities within it. I mean, Maduro is the president, but there are many different groups and factions that are all part of the Maduro movement that all have their own kind of center of gravity. I went to a collectivo that was run by a socialist priest. He's very charismatic. He has his own writings, his own followings. He's got a group of people who follow him. He's a supporter of Maduro, and so, I went to another thing that was associated with a guy who was in the Communist Party, another collectivo, and again, very charismatic, and that's one thing I've noticed is that, like the old style cult of personality was like the whole country worships one great socialist leader. The new thing seems to be that that these are coalitions, right? The socialist movements, in Nicaragua and Venezuela, in Bolivia and places like that, tend to be big coalitions in which you have many dynamic personalities. So yeah, I mean, look, it's not necessary, right? I don't think cult of personality is necessary, but it might work in some instances. It worked very well. The Stalin cult of personality industrialized the USSR, raised millions out of poverty. Mao's cult of personality, defeated the Japanese, and but cult of personality also has big problems. So cult of personality is a tactic, right? Do cars work? Yeah, they work, but they pollute the environment, and sometimes they run out of gas. It's cult of personality is a tactic, and revolutionary movements have used it in the past effectively. But there's been times where they've used it and it wasn't effective. And just like democratic centralism, all of this is a tactic. We need to reconsider these things. We need to reconsider these things. Some things, take what works. I tell people when it comes to the communist movements of the world, Mao, Lenin, Baathism, Bolivarianism, socialism with Chinese characteristics, Juche ideology, all this stuff. We want to study all of it and blindly follow none of it and start trying to figure out a formula that will actually work in this country. Okay. All right. Is Biden handing back Afghanistan to the Taliban, who are enemies of Iran? I mean, to some degree or other, the Taliban is going to have a role in Afghanistan. There's no question about that. The question is that because they're enemies of Iran? I mean, I don't know about that. I think that the issue is that the United States is trying to have good optics. They're leaving all their contractors in Afghanistan, all the CIA people who are there. The USA is going to have a presence there, but the actual U.S. military will be withdrawing. And I think that's about the USA like improving its image, and that they've made some kind of arrangement with the Taliban. Now, I think the USA wants Afghanistan to remain a strategic epicenter of chaos. It wants there to be chaos spilling over the border into Iran and into China and into Russia. And I think they may have figured out a way of doing that without having a U.S. military presence there. And that's good optics, right? Biden comes out of this big new Brzezinski school, strategic disengagement, right? Where the USA looks like it's retreating while it's escalating the use of proxy forces. All righty. The role of the individual in history, right? Plekhanov wrote a very important book, The Role of the Individual in History. And it was largely a Marxist rebuttal to a very good book called Heroes and Hero Worship, which is by Thomas Carlyle, the Scottish conservative intellectual of the 1800s. And yeah, I mean, individuals play a role in history. Hugo Chavez quoted this book. What is the Marxist view of great men and great leaders in history, right? And great individuals. I mean, how can you have that if history is made by economic determinism? If it's the broad masses of people in their millions who make history, what is the role of a Che Guevara or a Lenin or where do these people, Rosa Luxemburg, where do these people come from? Well, there's a book on this, and that when individuals emerge who play this role, it's because they are giving voice to broad sentiments, right? And they represent big currents. They give voice. That's the point of the book. It's Yuri Plekhanov. I would check it out. The Role of the Individual in History. All right, modern monetary theory. I don't really know enough about it. I've heard a lot of people say it's junk. I've heard other people argue, well, the idea is the government can print money rather than taxing people, I think is the center of it. I don't know enough about it. All right, how can you read enough to debate right-wingers? Well, I think the main thing is to read right-wing material and debunk it and go through it point by point and debunk it, right? That's the mistake a lot of people who debate right-wingers don't, do, is they don't know right-wing talking points and they don't know how to debunk them. They just assume that with their ideas are better. No, you need to read the right-wing material and debunk it. I constantly tweet at PragerU. Why? Because I want to. PragerU says bold-faced lies about communism all the time, and so I constantly tweet at them, and I've made videos refuting them and all of that. Right? Look at PragerU. Look at right-wing, anti-communist YouTube channels. Look at the content that they're putting out and debunk it. Right? And find an answer and think it over. Right? And learn to argue against it, and never sound like a liberal, because they're totally prepared to argue with liberals, and people don't like liberals. Liberals are phony and they're not effective. How would my 4-point plan deal with toxic degradation of the environment? Very well. Step number one of my 4-point plan involves a mass program of reconstruction, right? High-speed railway would reduce the dependence on car travel, right? What's this here? The Democratic and Republican parties changing the next 20 years. Two parties changing the next 20 years. So that's the first thing, right? The reconstruction of the country would be done in a way that would be more ecologically sustainable, right? It wouldn't be about reducing consumption, but it would be, high-speed trains are much better for the environment than having everyone drive up and down on the highway, and it would be rebuilding things and having us interact with our environment. I would be a big push for, fusion energy and getting off of fossil fuels. So that's in step one. Step number two, public control of natural resources. Not only, if you have public control of the natural resources, do you have the profits from natural resources go into the public budget, but also you can have the state strategically plan out how those resources are used. No more is it every individual capitalist decides how much oil and how much coal and how much timber he wants to extract based on his profits, but you can strategically plan it out to do it in a sustainable way. So both point 1 and 2 directly impact the toxic degradation of the environment. So there you go. There you asked how my 4-point plan would do it. I gave you step 1 and I gave you step 2. Step 1 would affect it. Step 2 would affect it. There you go. All right. How is China socialist if it has private property? Marxists always distinguish between personal property and private property, right? Personal property is anything you use. Private property is means of production that are private, right? So that's the first thing, right? When Marx says communism gets rid of private property, he's not saying gets rid of your toothbrush or your house or your car. It's about it has the means of production be operated for public control. That's number one. But number two is that China has a mixed economy. Now, many people have pointed out, and it's been widely said, that there's not really any private property in China, right? That if someone has something that's private, it's because the state wants them to, right? Many people will say things like there's no such thing as a private company in China. And, the major centers of economic power and the state itself have the ability at any point to reclaim any piece of property. So, technically there are people who own things in China, but they don't really own it because they don't have property rights to it, right? And it's done in coordination with an overall state central plan. Socialism is not the abolition of private property, right? Socialism, how will U.S. imperialism end? Socialism is the elimination of production for profit and the reorganization of the economy as production upon a predetermined plan, as Frederick Engels lays out in Section 3 of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Situation in Myanmar. Myanmar, it's a military government, military junta, and that military junta has become more and more pro-Chinese over the past 20 years. And, under the Obama administration, huge efforts were made to open up Myanmar, meaning increase U.S. influence in Myanmar, have more political parties, etc. What that meant was that the pro-Chinese military junta had to share power with some U.S. aligned forces. That's what that really meant. And now, based on the crisis in the country, the fear there could be, civil war, there's unrest among ethnic groups, the military retook the government. I don't approve of that. I'm just telling you what happened. And that's what happened. And so there's a lot of people in the country who are like pro-U.S. and such, and they want more representation in the government for pro-U.S. folks. They don't want the military to have, the pro-Chinese military to have the dominance on politics. But the pro-Chinese military, it moved ahead, and now it has the dominant position. That's basically what's been going on in Myanmar. Not that complicated. All right. Labor movement, is it dead in 2021? I wouldn't say it's dead. No, I mean, there's still labor unions and all that. But, I mean, it's bankrupt. I would say the leadership of the labor unions have discredited themselves and proved themselves to be inadequate. I would say that, I mean, there's been various failures. But no, I mean, there are a lot of working class people who are ready to organize, ready to fight. They want better wages. They want, there's a lot of working class people that are more labor movement oriented than ever. The problem in the labor movement is misleadership. It's a lot like the 1920s, right? We're back in the 1920s, basically. In the 1920s, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, was so bankrupt and awful, you had to have the upsurge of the Communist Party and the Trade Union Unity League and eventually the rise of the CIO, right? And as the Communist Party emerged and built its own labor unions, and eventually you had the rise of the CIO, the AFL got better because they were trying to play catch up. So, we need new left energy in the labor movement at this point because the misleaders of labor, the labor bureaucracy, they have taken things in a bad direction. Look, many people have talked about in Greece, where the labor unions are run by the Communist Party, how, they have a very different approach. They don't wait for the state to approve them, right? This was pointed out to me by a good friend. I mean, this idea that at Amazon we're going to have a vote, so the state will give us a piece of paper that says it's unionized. In Greece, the communist-controlled labor unions, they just recruit people who work in the plant, and they start organizing on their own, and they shut down the plant without ever having, officially unionized it, and they make demands without ever having officially unionized it. Look at the approach of communist labor unions around the world. This idea that, the goal is to get the government to say, you are officially unionized. A lot of communist labor unions around the world don't share that strategy, right? If they were organizing Amazon, they would shut it down. And they wouldn't wait for a vote to happen. They would just, they recruit a number of people in that plant. And when they were ready to move, they would shut it down and make demands. And that's a different approach, right? And that the labor militant approach that tends to be done by, communist-led labor unions is very different, very, very different. It's probably illegal here in the United States with Taft-Hartley and all of that. But then again, the labor movement, it used to be completely illegal to have a union at all. Did you know that? So there you go. It used to be strikes were illegal. Yeah, so there you go. All right. Is Syria socialist? Yes, it is, right? The Ba'ath Socialist Party in Syria, the major means of production are nationalized. It's a state centrally planned economy. They have, the Ba'ath Party is organized in neighborhoods. They have community assemblies that support, the government. They have a communist party that's in coalition with the Ba'ath Party. I would say that Syria is a socialist country, like Iraq, like Libya under Gaddafi. Yeah, yes. The answer is yes, right? The state and actually Bashar Assad said that in a recent interview. He said we are a socialist country. But Syria, it has a state centrally planned economy. It has workers, it has local committees to support the revolution. The means of production are organized to serve public good, not profits. It's an anti-imperialist government. I'd say it's socialist. All right. How do I see the two parties changing over the course of 20 years? Well, the Democratic Party at this moment seems to be on the course of becoming more and more the party of the establishment. They are what the Republicans were during the Cold War. Meanwhile, the Democrats or the Republicans are becoming much more and more the party of anti-establishment sentiments. And right now, that is coming from the right, libertarianism, etc. But we could start to see a left-wing anti-establishment current emerge among the Republicans. It may be that the Bernie wing of the Democrats and the DNC wing of the Democrats officially part ways. And it could be also that both major parties split. I mean, it seems like Trumpism is so well embedded in the Republican Party that they're not really going to split, but it's possible the Republicans and Democrats could both break into two. What's more likely is the Democrats will become more and more the mainstream ruling party, while Republicans become more and more the party of opposition and populism of all stripes. That's very, very possible. All right. Did I miss a super chat? I don't want to miss anything. How will U.S. imperialism end? It's the last question. How will U.S. imperialism end? Mainstream media likes to say Xi Jinping is taking China back to the Mao years. Yeah, that's not what he's doing. I mean, the Mao years were based on a very different level of economic development and a very different economic and global situation. So that's not what's happening. But they want to demonize Xi Jinping as a dictator or an authoritarian. That's what that's about. Now the last question is, how will U.S. imperialism end? U.S. imperialism will end when America's working families have had enough, when there is a mass movement that demands a government of action to fight for working families, and there is a mobilization among the U.S. working class to build up a mass democratic popular movement that takes office in Washington, D.C. on a peaceful, democratic platform, and then begins enacting, it rebuilds the country with a mass mobilization. It puts natural gas and oil and coal and timber and natural resources under public control. It puts banking under public control, and it enacts an economic bill of rights and restructures the U.S. economy by getting rid of the big corporations, the big banks, the big oil companies that drive the country to go toward war. Those big banks and corporations becoming public property, right? And the economy being reorganized to serve the American people and their desire for growth and progress rather than serving the interests of these private corporations, right? It's about restructuring the economy. Imperialism is an economic system where banks and corporations in the West dominate the global economy, keep the world poor, make the world poorer so that they can stay rich. And it will be ended when the economy of the United States is reorganized to serve public good and not profits. And I would prefer a peaceful transition to socialism, right? The election of a popular democratic movement. But that democratic movement would have to change the nature of the state. They would have to change the military. They would have to change the policing agencies, the FBI and the CIA and the military would all have to be changed in order to rechange that. And the country would have to move towards socialism in order to end U.S. imperialism. And as that would mean friendship with China, cooperating with Russia. It would mean a whole restructuring of the way the economy works, getting rid of profits in command and putting the needs of the people first. That's how imperialism will end. Imperialism is capitalism in its monopoly stage, and popular power defeating the big monopolies would end U.S. imperialism. That's my answer to that question. And on that note, we are going to end the show tonight. It's been fun. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world